All right, thanks guys for having me. As Dr. Greenwood said, I'm real happy to be back here. Unfortunately, the football game didn't go as we expected on Saturday night because I came away from Virginia to watch. This is why I'm here. So, like Dr. Greenwood said, I'm Dr. Kyle Levers. I'm an associate or assistant professor, not associate yet, of kinesiology at Longwood University. So, where is that? It's in Virginia, about an hour from Richmond. You never heard of it. Although we did have the VP debate last fall, which was fun because it was in our building. But anyway, we're in Central Virginia. We did host that, and no, it's not. It's located in Farmville, Virginia, and no, it's not part of the Facebook game, Farmville. So it's actually a real place, which I have a hard time convincing most people of. Anyway, so today we're going to talk a little bit about some of my dissertation, which has to do with tart cherry supplementation and endurance exercise, which is just one component of the dissertation research that I did here in the Exercise and Sport Nutrition Lab. So basically I want to give some of you, just catch everybody up on background of oxidants and oxidative stress. Some of you might be familiar with it, some of you not. So I'm going to talk about that, although we also are linking in inflammation here. I'm not going to go into depth in terms of inflammation, but I figured a little bit of oxidative stress we can talk about. So oxidative stress or oxidants are derived from things that are inside our body, outside our body, or endogenous or exogenous sources. So things like inflammation and exercise, obviously endogenous sources of oxidation. Also exogenous sources, things that are outside, smoke, radiation, pollutants, and things of that nature. As a result of these oxidants, right, we have biomolecules that can be damaged as a result, so proteins, lipids, DNA, and you can see also on the right here some examples of what might happen. Okay, so we might have some breakdown of DNA, we might also have some inactivation of enzymes, among many other things, and you can see why that might be a problem on an excessive level. Also talking about now the antioxidant hypothesis. So we're at a point where we have oxidation occurring as a result of exercise, aging, some other things that happen externally. What defenses do we have? So obviously we have an antioxidant-based defenses in our body that protect us against oxidants. One of the things that's been a common concept is, okay, how can I supplement that through nutrition and supplementation and just generally our diet to help reduce the risk of disease? And initially this stuff was investigated in terms of disease, right? And then we can back into it from a performance perspective, which is what we did. So from a more clinical health perspective, a researcher by the name of Gay looked at the antioxidant hypothesis, looking at that exact specific realm in terms of looking at the inverse relationship between plasma levels of things like vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, beta-carotene, and selenium in terms of heart disease and also mortality from heart disease. And what they basically found was, yes, there is an inverse relationship, and now, okay, so we intake more antioxidants at this point. Would that help us protect us against disease? Okay, so still kind of jury's still out at this point, but this is really the first study in the mid-90s that started addressing these issues, and you'll see in a second where some of the other research is coming from in terms of performance-based and also health-based. But looking here first, what is an antioxidant? We hear this term thrown around all the time, okay, and it's actually simply, in this particular element, really it's a chemical property. Okay, we generally classify things as an antioxidant or non-antioxidant, but it's really a chemical property of being able to donate electrons and induce type of stability is really what we're looking at. And you can see up here on this really simplistic chemical equation, right? You have a harmful free radical, has one electron here. I also have some sort of radical scavenger, and I'll give you an example in a second. But basically donating an electron from Y to X here will make X basically a non-radical because it's now more stable, okay, and I can excrete it. And now I also have a more stable radical. Yes, it's still a radical, but now it's more stable and I can do something with it. And that's really the name of the game here of antioxidant properties. Also looking at a sorbate here as one of those electron donors. And you can see that X here is an example of a free radical, and a sorbate donates one of its electrons. Now it becomes a sorbitol radical. But it's something that's heck of a lot more stable than our theorized X, which is now stabilized over here. Okay, so just give you an example of antioxidant background there. In terms of defending our body against excessive oxidation, our first round of defense is really an enzymatic one, right? So things like superoxide dismutase, where we can handle things that that basically scavenge for these free radicals that exist. Our second line of defense here is looking at endogenous sources, so things within that can help us donate those electrons and help balance out things that are more free radical based, things like vitamin E, beta carotene, things that are also exogenous sources. Okay? So vitamin C and E, beta carotene among flavonoids and polyphenols, which was what we're going to talk about with tart cherries today. All these are things that you can obtain from your diet, foods, vitamins, things of that nature. Okay? So basically 3 different classifications, 3 different levels that we can handle production of free radicals and also oxidative stress as a result. Also, obviously exercise. So we talked about clinical population. We talked a little bit about exercise a few minutes ago, but looking at exercise and increasing radical and reactive oxidative species or ROS production. Okay? So exercise does do that, and as a result, we have disturbances in muscle homeostasis and increased fatigue and potentially injury as a result of this oxidative stress or free radical production. The job of the skeletal muscle obviously is to reduce that. And we have monocytes that are located within there that have the ability in terms of 2 different classes to be able to enzymatically or non-enzymatically handle that problem or that production of excessive free radicals and things of that nature. And this is very general. Again, just kind of give you a little bit of a background. But how do we deal with that and what's going on? So early on, I told you that it was health-related based research. And that's sort of, we tend to back into these things from a performance perspective. They work in the clinical or health populations. And then we can turn it into, okay, how does this work for a performance type situation? So looking at here, obviously increased muscle fatigue. If we're an athlete or somebody who exercises frequently, that's not good. Okay? So how can we reduce? We never ever want to take away this oxidative stress or this production of reactive oxidative species or free radicals because we adapt according to the production of these. But it's when it's in large excess that our body can't handle it that we may want to look into different ways that we can supplement through antioxidant supplementation or other things that have antioxidant properties to help reduce things like muscular fatigue as a result. Okay? So early on, research up to the mid-90s, again, through the mid-90s, and you'll see some examples here in a table that I have, but they were looking at single antioxidants, things like vitamin C, vitamin E, right? So supplementing with beta carotene. So how does that affect oxidative stress and also production or deal with free radicals? So at this point, most of these studies, yeah, there's some altering of oxidative stress as a result of taking these in terms of exercise. But also, there's increased performance in animal models, but really no carryover to human models, okay, which is one of the initial problems that we see in the first bout of research here that I've listed a few that you'll see throughout the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So looking here, they also looked at what I was talking about before, decrease in oxidative stress, but no indicator on performance. And that led to a lot of skepticism. Okay, this theory maybe is not correct, or maybe it does work in the health-related population, clinical-based population, but maybe not in the performance realm. Okay? So then we continue, and later on, and remember, vitamin C, vitamin E, things like beta-carotene, single source, things that we've basically pulled out from different sources and trying to supplement in that capacity. What has turned around now in the mid-2000s, getting into this whole craze of functional foods, things that we can supplement with that are more holistic, more, we'll call it more natural, right? Things that contain multiple sources, and you'll see that here in a second. And this is exactly what they tried to replicate. So this study by Mortias Ruiz et al. In 2006, obviously an endurance-based study, trained male cyclists, looking at the comparison of placebo to this. So if you look at it, they built in a lot of different things within this supplement that they're calling an antioxidant-based supplement. And those 3 that I highlighted, they're going to become important later when I start talking about tart cherry. But anyway, you can see 90-minute test, not all that different than most endurance type activities at 70% VO2 max. What did they find? All right, so things like total antioxidant status, which you'll see here, and that's really a representation of antioxidant status as the whole human. Okay? Is going on. You can see there's real no difference there as a result of exercise or changes with placebo versus antioxidant supplement. Secondly, they actually did find something here that as a result of exercise, obviously creatine kinase, muscle breakdown increases. All right? So what the antioxidant supplement was able to do was attenuate that increase a bit and also attenuate a marker of lipid peroxidation, okay, or oxidation of in that capacity. So that was an interesting benefit to seeing that. Also, protein oxidation with placebo, obviously you can see is a huge increase. With antioxidant, a huge decrease, all right, or a notable decrease. So you can see there that overall, in conclusion, there are some protective effects of this antioxidant supplement. Remember, it's this whole combination, including protein and some carbohydrates as well. But there's a lot of individual variation. You can see here that some of these didn't show any result whatsoever, even with exercise. You can also see that some of these other ones showed a benefit. So where are we? Sort of in this toss-up situation, but it gives you a good idea of what the potential was moving forward. So why cherries, right? So why cherries? Like, who cares? Okay, so this is where we're at this point. Remember I talked about functional foods becoming more relevant. If you look up cherries or tart cherries, you'll see a lot related studies as well, including things like sleep disorders, mental cognition disorders, the whole spectrum, cardiovascular disease. All right, you'll see that. But a lot of it is upon the phytochemical containing fruits. So remember that list of 3 you saw? I think red currants is on that list in that supplement. That's another example of things that would contain some phytochemicals. So obviously, I talked about antioxidant. Also, we're involving anti-inflammatory effects. When we look at arachidonic independent and dependent pathways and its effects. The reason why things like tart cherry are important, especially the ones that are containing these phytochemicals, they are more specific yet more diverse. So I can work on more pathways and also specifically target different things that I want to in especially the inflammatory pathway, whereas I can't do that, or there's no effectiveness in specificity with NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Or antioxidant vitamins, things like vitamin C and vitamin E, right? So it's not as specific. So one of the interesting things from a pathway perspective is that these particular compounds contained within cherries, right down here, and they also contain some of the antioxidant vitamins we're talking about. Also, we mentioned beta-carotene previously that are endogenous, right? Have a lot of these compounds inherent to tart cherries. So there's a lot of different things that are in play here. And obviously, tart cherries are important. Why over other purplish red fruits and vegetables is because they have higher components of these phenolic or flavonoid compounds down here. And you can see that I've written that here. Although these have some, cherries have more. Okay, so that's where we're getting at. Here's some of the research. We're talking about endurance exercise today, right? So endurance exercise, previous to the research that we had done a few years back, there was 3 studies that were endurance-based. 2 of them were running-based. One of them was cycling-based, okay? And these are all endurance athletes. And overall, as a collective group, and I gave you some visual here, examples, but overall, as a collective group, what we saw was with supplementation of tart cherry juice concentrate, that'll be important in a second, okay? When you look at this, post-exercise muscle soreness went down, attenuated, good, okay? Also, inflammatory response decreased, okay? Lipid peroxidation, which we just talked about in the previous research, also decreased, and then antioxidant capacity increased, okay? Which is all a benefit across the board for all 3 of these studies, which is very interesting. So now we're into the current research. Remember I told you that those 3 previous ones were with juice or juice concentrate, tart cherry. All right, so let's talk about something that's a little bit different. So at this point, we have a supplement that is powder, okay? So what basically the company was doing with this particular supplement was, well, you can think of, let's back up a little bit. If you envision a cherry, right? So the goal of a cherry grower is to make money off of juicing a cherry, right? So producing cherry juice, or producing the cherry itself and selling that. So what they wanted to do is, okay, I have this skin that's left over. Is there any benefit to this skin product? So they wanted to check that out and sort of compare to what's already previously out there. So what they actually did is took the cherry skin, freeze-dried it, and powdered it. Is basically what they did to make the supplement. Okay, so at this point, what they were doing is an independent study. This particular research group looked at concentrate, so juice concentrate versus the powder. And this model right here is basically a simulation of the human digestive tract, small intestine, right? So we're basically simulating that type of environment. Okay, let's see what happens to the bioavailability of things that are prominent. So let's just take anthocyanins, for example, is a flavonoid that's contained in tart cherry, okay? So what they did was, okay, after 4 hours, 2 and 4 hours, what is occurring in terms of the bioavailability of those compounds? And it shows here, this preliminary research shows that is actually, those components are more bioavailable after 4 hours of digested in the small intestine compared to the juice concentrate, which is cool. The second component is, okay, just envision yourself post-exercise or during exercise, what would you rather have? What's easier to take? Some type of powder that you can combine with almost anything, right? Or try to ingest some sort of tart cherry juice or juice concentrate. Okay, I'm going to vote for the powder because I can combine it with anything else. I can put it into a post-workout supplement. I can do whatever I want with it. Okay, so it's also more palatable overall compared to a liquid surrounding exercise. So be thinking about that. All right, so the purpose of our current, what was the current study, now previous study, what we were looking at, one, was, okay, how does this compare on those parameters? So things like muscle soreness or muscle pain, inflammation, muscle damage, and also oxidative stress to the 3 previous studies. Secondly, is on its own, 10 days of supplementation, what occurs with those same 4 parameters? Okay? So that's really what we're investigating here. Overall, the methods, and I'm going to kind of go through this relatively quickly. You guys feel free to ask questions at the end about specifics about our particular protocol. But looking here, we used a standard issue placebo-controlled design, so 2 groups, placebo and tart cherry. We had 27 endurance-trained triathlete men and women. So they were trained individuals, and we had certain parameters for that to determine whether they were trained or not. We did a pair match controlled setup here where we match subjects based on those 4 criteria. So they're self-reported and also proven. Projected half marathon, because that's what we did. We ran a half marathon, and I'll go into that in a second. Their half marathon race pace, their fat-free mass, body weight, and also their age. After doing that and matching those subjects, then we went ahead and divided them up randomly into groups. Okay, so there was 2 groups, like I said, placebo, tart cherry, both receiving the same amount. So the placebo was a rice flour placebo, 480 milligrams. The other group was the tart cherry, 480 milligrams a day with this product over here on the right. So you can see that's what it looks like when it's not encapsulated. Here's what it looks like when it's encapsulated. Obviously, the subjects were blinded to it. The pills that we actually used were not clear like this. So they're actually red and white. You couldn't see through. They were pegs, so you couldn't tell what was inside. So obviously we did that on purpose to disguise what was going on. Looking at the hemodynamic variables, you're going to see a lot of things that we looked at for this particular study, actually a ton. But looking at primarily, we talked about anti-inflammatory and pro-inflammatory effects. All right, so this is what we want to know from a hemodynamic standpoint. Okay, what markers can tell us information? And we had a whole host of markers that we could take a look at here. And also, obviously, antioxidant status. We want to know what changes from an oxidation standpoint occurred as a result of this particular study. And then what occurs from the muscle standpoint? A muscle breakdown, also muscle catabolism versus primary and secondary markers, and then also looking at anabolic and catabolic hormones. Okay, so direct a little bit of what's going on anabolically and catabolically in the body as a result of taking this supplement and in response to a half marathon, right? And then also sort of a tertiary component that we're looking at is, okay, what's the immune response generally, just through general immune markers that you might see in a blood lipid or blood panel from the doctor, okay? So that is the whole host of hemodynamic variables. A lot of fun running all those, for sure. But anyway, looking at the general overall study timeline, okay? So we had 5 different sessions, and it'll be more, or sessions, it'll be more apparent here when I flash some of the other fill-in material. But 5 different ones surrounding this endurance. So I said 10 days of supplementation, which you can see here in the green. Okay, so we had a really a pre-study familiarization here with a blood draw, kind of get a baseline of what's going on here, some other information that we needed to divide and randomize the subjects per groups. They started supplementing everybody together. Started supplementing, so all 27 started supplementing together for 10 days. 7 days into that, actually on the 8th day, that was when they were running their half marathon, okay? So in the middle of that day, and I'm going to break out this part of the timeline here in a second, but pre-exercise, 60 minutes post, 24 hours, 48 hours post with the time doing testing. All right, so you'll see here that we had blood draw at each one of those time points and also something called muscle soreness, GPRS, right? So muscle soreness was rated on a graphic pain rating scale. So what we did was we used something called an algometer, which is just a pressure gauge basically. And on 3 distinguished points on the quadricep muscle group, depending on biomechanically what was best for running, okay, we specific spots on the vastus lateralis and medialis, and we applied the same pressure. And the way that we regulated that was through this out here. So I was able to apply, or whoever's working with me was able to apply 50 newtons of force to those specific areas every time that subject was tested, every other subject that was tested. Made it pretty standardized. Okay? So applying 50 newtons of force, holding it there, they would rate on a graphic scale where they fell, in terms of not so sore, sore, and it was sort of this scale that was laid out that we could gauge where they were accordingly. All right, so, and that happened every testing session. So when we break out the specific day of the half marathon, okay, and this is a simplistic view, but again, blood sample coming in. So they were 10 hours fasted for this particular blood sample. So be thinking about this for any of you who are endurance people, okay? You're 10 hours fasted, you're asked to run a half marathon. You're also going to get a blood draw. And then we're going to talk about muscle soreness. So then we run the half marathon. We kind of allowed them to do whatever warm-up for 10 to 15 minutes that they normally did, so they could sort of accommodate to their own personal environment zone for running a half marathon. Finish time, recorded, calculated 60 minutes post. They were not allowed to do anything in terms of a cool down to keep it standardized, except walk back to a short distance to the lab and hang out there for 60 minutes. And then post-run, blood draw, and then also muscle soreness. Same thing repeated 24 hours post and 48 hours post, all calculated out. Okay? So that's general layout of what we did. Statistical analysis, obviously looking at nutritional data and also demographic data, standard one-way ANOVA, and then we used for the rest of the data and a MANOVA with repeated measures due to the large scale of information that we had collected. Now you'll see in a second that we identified a covariate once we started analyzing the material and the data. So as a result, we also reran the data with an ANCOVA to account for that covariate, which was hugely important to make sure everything was standardized and representative of the change in supplement as opposed to something else. All right, so all in all, the results. Okay, so obviously I said before, we looked at the demographics and also the nutritional data with one-way ANOVA comparing both groups. Okay, you notice here that there's no difference here in the demographics. There also is here no difference in nutritional value. We also looked at from self-reported dietary logs, okay, their dietary intake of beta-carotene, vitamin C, and vitamin E. We talked about why those were important earlier in terms of the dietary supplement. Okay. While this is not a primary research outcome, it was also important for us to look at running performance. Okay, so the two groups were not different in terms of their projected race pace. They were not different to start with. You can see that there's some significance going on here. So their split time and also their finish time were statistically different. Okay, so the tart cherry group actually ran the half marathon faster, which is interesting. Okay, by that same token, both groups were different. They actually ran the half marathon slower than they projected that they would. Okay, and that could be for a couple of different reasons. It could have been conditionally related. It could have been their motivation wasn't quite there as compared to other competitive races that they had run. Whatever it might have been, slower. The tart cherry group actually ran closer to their projected race pace, significantly to the placebo, which was interesting. So as a result, like I said, covariate. So we had one group that ran it faster than the other. Well, that means probably that they were running at a higher intensity, right? But we did not want that higher intensity to affect any of the other data, so of course running time and finish time became a covariate for the rest of the data that we analyzed, accounting for that potential to be higher intensity overall as an average group for the tart cherry group. Looking at markers of muscle breakdown or protein catabolism here, overall you'll see, just based on visually looking here, and I tried to highlight some areas to give you an idea of where there were statistically significant differences by time point. Okay? But on the whole, there were significant differences between the cherry group and the placebo group. The cherry group attenuated muscle protein breakdown or muscle catabolism or protein catabolism more than the placebo post-exercise. Okay, same thing for secondary markers of muscle damage during the recovery. You can see where some of the specific occurrences happen, but these are secondary markers of muscle damage and stress. But also interesting to look at that tart cherry had the same effect here as they did in the primary markers that we looked at previously. Also looking at hormone status overall, cortisol was interesting in terms of a marker of catabolism, right? So overall, as a catabolic state, the body was in a lower catabolic state. Here you can see that the effects of cortisol were attenuated 60 minutes post as a result of dietary supplementation. Okay? No effect on anabolic hormones unless we only tested or only looked at testosterone and then the cortisol-testosterone ratio and found no significant effect there between the groups. All right. Similar to some of the previous studies that I showed you, specifically the ones that were non-tart cherry, there was no effect here or no difference between groups in terms of the oxidative status, the markers of oxidation, things of that nature. But what was different was what's graphed or shown here visually, is total antioxidant status increased significantly in the tart cherry group as a result of that 10-day supplementation. So you can see it's increasing generally over the course of the recovery as a result of that supplementation. And remember, these people continued to supplement in the recovery. So the race day was on day 8. They also supplemented on day 9, and they also supplemented on day 10. Right? So be thinking about that as well in terms of this. But again, no differences in free radical or oxidative stress markers, and that's what I showed here in the table below. Okay. Inflammatory response, we had a whole host of markers. You remember back to the hemodynamic variable table. We had a whole host of markers. Overall, there was a tendency for groups to be different over time. Okay, not quite significant, but you can see from some of the percentages that I listed at certain time points, tart cherry seemed to attenuate a little bit. One thing you have to remember about this supplementation is, one, the situation that it's taken in. So half marathon is a highly stressful event for most people. Okay? And there's only a 10-day short time span supplementation. Okay? The second thing is we don't completely want to abolish this inflammatory response. For some of your muscular physiology or physiology classes, obviously that's a way we adapt. Right? That's a way we adapt to stress and things of that nature. So we don't want to completely remove it. Again, this is a situation where we want to supplement the body's ability, endogenous ability to deal with oxidative stress and inflammation as a result of an event of this type of stress level. Also looking at the anti-inflammatory response, there are certain markers of the anti-inflammatory response that we were looking at. And this pretty much correlates with the inflammatory response, as you might expect. Some of the markers didn't really show much in terms of any significant difference between the groups. One of them did, and it corresponds well. IL-13 corresponds well to these two, what these were showing in terms of an increase in antioxidant capacity with tart cherry, or anti-inflammatory response with tart cherry supplementation. Also, the last thing that we were looking at here was muscle soreness. Remember, this was a big outcome variable that we wanted to look at from previous studies. And actually, we didn't find anything. No difference between the groups. Tart cherry supplementation versus placebo, no difference in muscle soreness perception post-exercise. What we did find, which was interesting, was muscle soreness was attenuated pre-run. So remember, they would have supplemented 7 that 8th day. They would have been supplementing 8 days with that. So as a result, pre-run, they were significantly attenuated pre-run, so meaning the tart cherry group had a lower perception of soreness going into the half marathon compared to the placebo, which was kind of interesting. The other thing you can see here, just a little on the side, here's what we're talking about with the algometer. Okay, marking those different locations on the vastus lateralis and medialis here. Here's the algometer. You can't see it, but it looks like the tip of a pencil, like an eraser side of a pencil, right? And it just pressed into the surface there. Just give you an idea what that looked like. All right, so overall in discussing what was going on here, remember our primary objective was to compare across the research that had been done previously in endurance-based athletes or endurance-based individuals. So what we did find is, yes, we found some proof of attenuation of catabolic markers or muscle breakdown, also inflammatory markers. We also looked at some type of increased antioxidant response, a more balanced oxidative status redox balance compared to the placebo as a result of supplementing. And that would indicate some of the things that we talked about before. So yes, did we find a benefit with oxidative stress? Yeah. Did we find a benefit with inflammation? Yeah, we saw some evidence there. We also saw some evidence of attenuating muscle damage. We did not find anything, as we discussed, with muscle soreness, okay? Which is something that we were looking for as well, but maybe this particular supplement does not have an effect in that capacity. So, limitations of this particular study. As inherent to type of recruitment in this type of population, yes. Was it random? Absolutely. But was it only limited to College Station and Texas A&M University? For sure. So is it completely random? You could argue no. Also, the other thing is we talked about intrinsic motivation. So why was the half marathon projected race pace different from the actual? Okay, there could have been a lot of factors that would have been involved in that would have been out of our control. But again, motivation is also something that, as much as you try to motivate the runners, and I think that they were, you never know if they were giving 100% effort, as with a study design like this. Okay, supplement instructions, we did the best we could. We laid out supplement instructions very well, and they finished the supplement at the end of the study. Never know when you specify, okay, you're going to take this supplement, 480 milligrams with breakfast at approximately 8 a.m. every day for 10 days. Did they actually do that? So that's obviously a limitation, unless I'm hanging out on their shoulder watching them every day, to this type of research, and not having them come in and take the supplement. Also, we had limitations that I may have glossed over a little bit, but exercise, a 48-hour restriction prior to the marathon and throughout the rest of the study. So basically days 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, they were restricted from outside exercise besides what we were doing. Also, same thing with NSAIDs, some non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, things like ibuprofen, no go. And then fasting, before every blood draw, they were required to fast at least 8 to 10 hours. That you have to rely heavily on subjects understanding the importance of that can be a limitation. And then also, we allowed them to freely live the first couple days of the study. So before they had those restrictions, we allowed them to do their normal dietary habits, and we saw before that there was no dietary difference based on self-reporting between the groups. Okay? But dietary habits could have been different if they didn't follow the consistent habits that they reported. And also, obviously, we matched subjects based on 4 criteria. This was not a crossover study. So we matched people. There's obviously inherent limitations with matching people just based on 4 criteria. Okay? So keeping that in mind. Lastly, just to rehash all of this, we said no real difference that we saw in muscle soreness following this endurance exercise. And then obviously catabolic and physiological stress markers. Yeah, we saw a little bit of attenuation there. Proof of that. Same thing with inflammation. And then obviously antioxidant response or better redox balance. We saw an increase as a result of tart cherry supplementation. You can see some of the pictures here from the day we actually ran it on campus here. And then lastly, looking at, okay, moving forward, what's some research that could be done moving forward? Obviously, you're probably thinking direct comparison between powdered version, concentrate, juice, or any other form that tart cherry is included in these days. Yes. Or just straight up consumption of the type of cherry that we used for this particular study. Absolutely, and here's some examples right here of what it might look like. So yes, and then basing it off of equal content across the board, because some of the tart cherry supplements do not have equal content of some of those anthocyanins or other phenolic or flavonoid compounds. And also looking at different exercise modalities. If you remember back to the beginning of what I was talking about, the 3 studies that had been done previous to this was 2 running based. One was a marathon and one was basically a team type relay endurance event. And also the last one was a cycling based event. So looking at, okay, how does this supplement affect things like endurance type swimming? How does it affect triathletes? How does it affect running based and cycling based? That has not been explored other than this study in the powdered supplement version. Okay. Also looking at longer term supplementation. How does this effect go beyond 10 days? Okay. What does that look like moving forward? And really nothing has looked at things in terms of a training type modality or a training type supplement that'll go along with modalities for longer periods of training. And then lastly, also obviously the biggest one, yet the most expensive thing that could be looked at moving forward, is looking at the bioavailability of some of these phytochemical active compounds in these foods, juices, and other concentrates. What is actually responsible for some of these? Obviously, one of the most expensive ways that you'd have to go about it, but an example might be, okay, anthocyanins. Yes, we did some bioavailability, but just looking at a simulated human model in terms of what the gut looks like, what the intestine looks like, in terms of that environment. But what actually is going on, can we analyze that moving forward? And that's something that could be taken on. Lastly, I'd like to thank everybody that was involved in this project. It's a huge list. A lot of people who helped with this project and were very instrumental in pushing this project to completion. Just thank to everybody up here. I don't have time to go through it all, but just give you an idea of everybody that's involved. And also I want to thank you guys for having me, allowing me to come down and present. I got to escape Virginia for a little bit and come back and watch some football. We don't have football where I am, so that's pretty unfortunate. We wouldn't be very good even if we did, so let me promise you that. And then I'll take any questions if you guys have them.